Hey, so chances are if you're watching this video, you've already seen Anthony Fantana's review of the new Godspeed album. He was generally unimpressed with the album. He gave it a 5 out of 10. He spent 5 minutes kind of briefly addressing why he didn't like it, but I don't feel like he went into too much depth when he was talking about it, so that's kind of what I wanted to do here. I've been working on this review, I guess you could call it. It's going to turn out more like a rant because I'm not going to bother editing it. But I've been working on it since the album's release, and I started off not liking the album, but as I've listened to it more and more, I'm beginning to think that it's one of the strongest entries in the Godspeed discography. I'd put it only slightly below the original three, Slow Riot, Skinny Fists, and F sharp, A sharp. So it's a close number 4 for me. It's above Yankee. So let's go through the reasons why. So before reviewing Luciferian Towers, it's important to evaluate the album's importance in regards to the band's discography. People may say that this skews perception, that it only evaluates success and failure on a micro scale. However, Godspeed doesn't make isolated works. Their releases may be monoliths, but together they make Stonehenge. It's more effective to review Stonehenge than just one stone from it that you pick at random. So, before I begin, I'd like to define some terms here. Now, these are terms that I consider important to Godspeed's style of music and certain things you're going to be looking for when listening to one of their albums. These terms are swell/highs, drone/lows, gradient/segue, atmosphere, texture, and cohesiveness. So let's start with the swells or the highs. So these are the building climax moments in a song, and they can serve as a method of conveying elation, anger, and power, and when utilized properly, it benefits the atmosphere of the album, but it requires superb gradient in order to execute well. Drone and lows, these are the quiet moments that partition lengthy songs and provides atmosphere when executed correctly. This requires superb texturing as opposed to gradient, because if a drone is boring, then obviously people aren't going to be excited listening to it. Gradient or segue, this is the gradual or sudden transition between drones and swells. Gradient is used to create texturing in a subtle manner and build the anticipation of the listener. Texture is the sound of the instrument, so distortion, effects, speed, volume, anything like that, and how the instruments interact with others through layering and harmonizing. It serves atmosphere very well as drone, and it requires gradient in order to be executed properly. Atmosphere is the visuals and thoughts that emerge from listeners' abstraction of an album's content, and this is served by gradient, texture, swells, and drone, and it serves cohesiveness. Cohesiveness is how well the work feeds back into itself, so it defines the relationship between smaller works and the collective work as a whole. It's served by gradient and atmosphere as well as texture to some extent, and it's more or less the best metric to use when evaluating an album. And then there's one more term, and that's innovation, and I just define that simply as breaking the pre-existing metric in a successful manner. So, all of these terms are important to Godspeed's work, and I'll explain why to some length here. So swells and highs serve atmosphere. So if music was an essay, these swells are Godspeed's thesis. It shows the core atmosphere of the album, and it's generally the most emotional moment of a song. At its most emotional moment, an album exposes its true nature, and this establishes atmosphere. So a good example of this would be at 5 minutes and 32 seconds into the song Antennas to Heaven. Lows and drones also serve atmosphere. In the same way that an energetic moment exposes the emotions of a song, so does drone and lows. It serves as the opposite end of swells, showing what the atmosphere of a song is like when something isn't happening. A good example of this would be the drones that are on the track Providence and F sharp, A sharp, Infinity. Gradient serves texture, and texture serves gradient. The two coexist together. Gradient necessitates change and evolution, and subtle change and evolution necessitates gradient. So a good example of this would be the build on the song Moya. So in order for a gradient to work properly, something needs to be changing over time, and this change is done at the micro scale through texture, while gradient refers to the macro scale of the song progressing. Alright, and where's this last one? Gradient serves swells very well, so swells are taken out of context, they're just noise. Their climactic success is dictated by the gradient that precedes it. So an example would be the song Motherfucker Equals Redeemer, where it's doing the gradient rise into the swell. Texture also serves swells. Texture, more specifically in this case layering, serves swells by harmonizing existing instruments and flushing out their roles through the gradient. So to put this simply, when you're listening to a Godspeed song and you're waiting for that climactic moment, you want to get there through a slow, gradual build-up. And in this build-up, new instruments are being added, and they're playing with each other in the process. Gradient also serves drone. So gradient is more accurately translated to dynamics in this situation. Drones can't be static or isolated, otherwise they fail to serve the greater atmosphere. So basically this is just saying that the drone precedes a swell because the drone provides a good buffer between the highs and the lows. So a good example of this would be the drone bordering the gradient and voice recordings on East Hastings. Texture also serves drone. More accurately, texture translates to interaction in this situation. Drones have to be diverse in order to be engaging and eventually create atmosphere. So a good example of this, like before, is the drone bordering the gradient and voice recordings on East Hastings. So, not going to cover the specifics of texture and gradient serving atmosphere as it's already been addressed through the other comparisons. So, I'm just going to jump to atmosphere and how it serves cohesiveness. So, when an album successfully creates atmosphere, it allows the audience to abstract specific emotions from the entire listening experience. The more abstraction occurs, the more cohesive the end result. So while atmosphere is hard to tie to a single moment, the best example of this would be the violin outro of BBF3 off of their EP Slow Ride for New Zealand, Canada. So now we've got the terms out of the way, and it's laid out pretty clearly what constitutes Godspeed and what's made up their music to date. So let's jump right into covering each of the albums and providing historical context for this new album. So Lift Your Skinny Fist Like Antennas to Heaven. This is possibly the most accessible entry in Godspeed's discography, and in my personal opinion, their best work. Storm is a perfect example of the Godspeed formula working well. It starts quiet and simple, uses texture to gradually introduce and harmonize new instruments, and it swells into a much louder and more textured rendition of the intro. It then holds pace, climaxes, returns to a drone/low, and then repeats, and sometimes this can be repeated multiple times depending on the song. So this song has more or less solidified this formula, making it a classic Godspeed staple. The song Static is without a doubt the album's most in-depth exploration of drone. So Sleep goes on to illustrate the gradient and swells, and the album closes with a half and half dose of the two sides, creating beautiful atmosphere in the process. So that is to say that both highs and lows and the texture and gradient all work together cohesively on the song Antennas to Heaven to create better cohesion. Their second entry, Slow Riot for New Zealand, Canada, I'd consider this a balance between the beauty of Lift Your Skinny Fist Like Antennas to Heaven and the depressingly bleak F-sharp, A-sharp Infinity. The traditional song structure emerges from Moya, I'd say, so this is the first song that Godspeed's released that I'd say follows their formula specifically. Their songs on F-sharp, A-sharp Infinity didn't necessarily do this. That album had a much different style than the rest of the discography. Blaze Bailey Finnegan also has the added benefit of expertly weaving in a field recording, providing a massive boost to the atmosphere. As for F-sharp, A-sharp Infinity, this is the end of the line atmospherically. Without a doubt, it's the darkest and bleakest the band has ever been. And visually, this album sounds like a ruined skyline, ash-choked air, decay, and the echo of humanity who's been gone for a very, very long time. I'd say that this ranks third in my list of the top three. And I'd say that these are solidly the top 3 albums Godspeed's produced. It's their earliest work, it's what they're best known for, and I'm not sure if anything's ever going to surpass that. On that note, let's move on to Yankee UXO. So, now that we've gotten past the first 3 albums Godspeed made, we're kind of in uncharted territory here. Each album is unclear in regards to what you're supposed to take away from it. I believe the best way to describe Yankee is a perfection of texture and gradient at the cost of atmosphere and cohesion. The interaction between instruments and harmony is unparalleled in their discography, and Motherfucker Equals Redeemer is the single best example of gradient and swell on any Godspeed work. Unfortunately, the album lacks the thematic cohesion other than a loose grasp of war and rage, so this doesn't make it very high. I'd put this at number 5. Alleluia Don't Bend Ascend was the band's next album, and if they're going to make a comeback after 10 years of radio silence, like they did with their hiatus, they're going to need to demonstrate that they still have full control over their strengths. So Alleluia Don't Bend Ascend is far from adventurous, but it hits all the right marks. If I had to point out where it might have been lacking, it would probably have been cohesion and gradient. Having 2 drone tracks separate from the primary work really detracted from cohesion, and the tracks by themselves are borderline lacking the texture necessary to keep them interesting. I'd consider this album a true vanilla release in their discography, and it's the minimum standard of what a quality Godspeed album should be. And that just leaves us with the unequivocated failure that was Asunder Sweet and Other Distress. This album, while exploring uncharted territories, fails to offer a substantial contribution to the discography. Asunder Sweet was an album entirely composed of live material, specifically the 45-minute long work titled Behemoth. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but live composition and spontaneous playing will always lack in texture due to the band members not being able to read each other's minds. And because they can't read each other's minds, obviously they don't know what each other's going to play, and they can't work off each other as well than if they had practiced. So essentially this means that the band had to fill the wall of sound with a cheap substitute. In this case it was distortion. Complex interactions that take painstaking planning completely vanish, not to mention that the band recycled their previous formula of having 2 main attractions and 2 drone tracks used as filler. And I get a lot of criticism for saying this sometimes. Many people believe that those 2 tracks, Lamb's Breath and Asunder Sweet, weren't filler. However, I have first-hand evidence that this was probably the case. So in 2005, I went to go see Godspeed perform live, and I watched them perform Behemoth. And when Lamb's Breath and Asunder Sweet were supposed to be played, all that happened was one of the band members strummed a note on the bass guitar. They set it down next to an amplifier and let it create a feedback loop. Then they took a 16-minute long break where they drank water, occasionally contributed with a plucked note, and then they returned to their instruments and retuned them. So you already know that this was an album adopted from live performances. So do you really believe that they put as much effort into something that was A, already composed, but more specifically, what was just supposed to serve as a water break? There's only one good thing that came from this album, and it was probably the introduction and liberal use of heavy distortion. The band hadn't really done that before, and because they decided to be adventurous in this case, it might not have paid off at first, but it definitely paved the way for Luciferian Towers. So that brings us to the album that just came out recently, the one that hasn't been getting great reviews. I'd say that Luciferian Towers is by far the strongest release in the band's post-hiatus discography, and it's possibly better than Yankee UXO. The album is also the most innovative approach to the band's standard format. It retains the good achieved from the attempt to push the envelope with Asunder Sweet and Other Distress, and it also develops on the original format. So first, let's examine where the band innovated and built upon the success of their original structural dynamic. The drones included on these tracks are far more textured than previous 2 albums. So not only that, but they're also far more exciting and thematically linked to the swells that they accompany. Speaking on the matter of both drones and swells, the band blurs the line between the 2 by creating swells through texture alone, not just volume and quantity of instruments. For those who enjoyed the drone tracks from Alleluia and Asunder because they provide breathing room, Undoing a Luciferian Towers and Fam/Famine provide this breathing room without letting it become boring. Instead of being brackets that divide the album meaninglessly, they act as the overture and interlude respectively. Speaking of overtures and interludes, something that I've always enjoyed about Godspeed Atmospheres done well is that the albums play out like a movie. This is certainly the case on Luciferian Towers. So, just to give you a perspective of what I'm talking about here, the sign that something can be extracted well from an album and create visuals along with it is if you can kind of imagine in your head a movie that's being played out just from what you're hearing. And this was definitely the case for this album with me, so I'd just like to walk through what I'm seeing here. So on Undoing the Luciferian Towers, you're seeing a shot opening, it's a sunny day, and then it pans down to a bustling city, and it shifts to a sour note at about 1 minute and 14 seconds into the song, and you get to see that this is a society in discord where people are happy and functioning on the surface level, but we're looking at what's below the surface now, and we're seeing ugliness, hate, and maliciousness. We're seeing cities filled with people trudging to work, getting mugged, starving, remaining dead silent as they walk through life in complete misery. So this is just not a place you want to be. And the final spouting of the song's melody at 6:11 shows us that this is an anthem and testament to a miserable power structure. So it's creating and sowing discord by its very nature, and it's something that the people want to get rid of. Now on the track appropriately titled Bosses Hang, a collective realized that the current state of affairs is completely untenable and they need to do something to change it. They hang their bosses at 3:13 after being torn from their supervising stations and facing the misery that they've sown at 2:05. And then a sense of relief is shared by all, and a brief moment of serenity is found at 4:20 before the workers go back to their stations and begin their work and their plan of vengeance. So this starts kind of at 4:45 in the song and ends at 9:08. At 9:08, the machine begins producing at full capacity, and here you can hear the instruments reflect this with a rhythmic chugging that kind of sounds like a train or machinery. And then at 13:05, it's done. Whatever they've been building, it's been created. It's a massive metal humanoid, and it's programmed with the sole command of destruction. So he's looked at with awe, and he begins his work. He begins destroying everything around him. And then you cut to the song Famine. As the machine mobilizes, it pans back up to the skyline, and from just below the frame you can see the creation of intense fires burning in the city, and it's offering a small peek at the massive destruction that's taking place. And that just slowly pans to the sun setting in the distance, and then it finally sets at the beginning of Anthem for No State. So now that the sun's completely set, the survivors of this massive destruction look out at a landscape in complete ruin, much like the one described in Dead Flag Blues on F#A# Infinity. People band together and they all share their hopes of a promising future they'll build from the ashes. And then that's when the climax of the album hits. And it's the realization at 5:51 that the metal humanoid that they've built to destroy everything, it didn't perish either. And he's still only programmed to destroy, meaning that it'll go after the survivors too. Everyone mobilizes to disable it, and its body is scaled as it thrashes violently, destroying even more stuff in the ruins, and the album ends with the shutdown of this massive machine. Now, obviously, it's kind of hard to interpret what this is, considering that it's unlikely the band would even agree with this interpretation. They're a very heavily anarchist band, and the visions that this album produced for me were very much anti-anarchy. And the reason I say this is because you're kind of creating this this overthrowing of the current system. Then everything gets destroyed and people think they can build a better life from the ashes, and then they realize that the person that they picked to replace the current power structure, which is this massive metal humanoid who only knows how to destroy, he's going to keep doing what he knows how to do, which is destroying. So it makes it clear that revolution really isn't great if you don't have a solid leader to fill the void. But anyway, enough about all this. So the end point of that, and the only reason I read this is I kind of wanted to help everybody understand what I mean by I think this album has cohesion. I think it has solid atmosphere. I don't think it's boring or mundane at all, as the needle drop mentioned in their review. This is definitely one of the most cohesive albums for me in Godspeed's discography. I'd probably say that it's just below F sharp, A sharp, Infinity in quality. I'd probably give it like a 9 out of 10. I'd really say it's up there. I think that people aren't giving this album that much of a chance, and the reason that I made this long, ranty, improvised video is because I really want to get the word out there soon, and as soon as possible, that this album needs to be given a chance. Don't dismiss this as being a weak entry, listen to it 3 times and then forget you ever heard it again. Seriously sit down with this album, because it definitely has something to offer. It was building upon the pre-existing structure to Godspeed's format, and I think that the changes that it's using are really pushing it in the right direction. So the harmony between instruments is noticeably more involved and textured than any of the band's other albums besides Lift Your Skinny Fist, and it's probably why some critics have been referring to it as generally cheerful. And I guess it's also important just to mention that the distortion that they use in this album is distortion used right. So this is clearly an example of the band finally figuring out what they want to do with distortion and executing it properly, as opposed to their last album, in which it was kind of just used to fill empty space. Here it actually benefits the sound and the texture of the instruments as a whole. I'd say that's about all I had to say on this album. So, love it or hate it, just make sure you're giving it a fair shot, and yeah, don't listen to melonheads. Thanks.